For those considering whether or not to read Dune, it's not as good as everyone says it is, it's long, weary and dreary, and it doesn't deserve its status as classic sci-fi. So, read Dune for the status of having read it, but don't kid yourself into thinking you're going to be reading some revolutionary masterpiece. The rest of this review shall be chock full of spoilers. Part 1. Not as good as everyone says it is. So you might have heard that Dune is the epitome of sci-fi. It is the sci-fi canon. You haven't read Dune? Can you even call yourself a sci-fi fan? That is the precise reason why I decided to trudge through this entire 500-something pages. And indeed, it was a trudge, because I found myself thoroughly disliking the journey, yet determined to see it through, because, for the love of me, couldn't fathom why everyone was heralding it as a groundbreaking work of fiction when it is mediocre at best. True, it's the inspiration for lots of other stories that have become iconic in pop culture, but I don't think that's determinative of its greatness. It simply means it has a lot of marketable traits that other writers have taken in stride and made better, more interesting, and even more marketable stories out of them. Dune itself is not as famous as a lot of the stories it has inspired, and perhaps there are reasons for that. A lot of people will then tell you to read it for the concepts rather than the story. In part 3, I will expand on why I feel even the concepts are lackluster. For now, let me just say, if I'm only reading it for the concepts and the story itself leaves much to desire, well, why the hell is it in novel form then? The form should enhance the message rather than just coincidentally be what it is. A story should be written as a novel only if the writer believes a novel is the best way to convey the desired message. If I'm only meant to read Dune for its amazing concepts or themes, I would just go read some political and philosophical journal articles or go back to any of my high school English classes. Conversely, if the story itself doesn't enhance the theme either, then the book has no good reason to exist. The plot and setting are often described as rich and complex and very modern, when it is only superficially so. The story is set tens of thousands of years into the future, where a war between man and machine has resulted in a decree that apparently all worlds just unanimously agreed upon at the time, with no repercussions whatsoever, to eliminate all computers and stop manufacturing any machines that resemble the human mind. Because Dune clearly sports a soft magic system, we're not going to nitpick the details of the technological advancements, such as freaking space travel, that have occurred since the time that all computers were wiped out and have somehow managed to exist independently from computers. But even if we overlook all of that, the audience is meant to find this scenario completely plausible. The scenario that, in the event of a bloody all-nations interplanetary war, a decree to eliminate all computers can be passed and then adhered to. So, everyone just agrees to this? Additionally, because computers are gone now, all political systems have apparently reverted to this medieval feudal imperialism, rife with all the oppression and corruption that such a social hierarchy comes with. So you're also saying that all of humanity has just regressed because computers are gone. It's fine if Herbert wants to write a medieval story, but trying to package it as a natural path for humanity to turn to just isn't working here. Just because computers have been wiped out, that doesn't mean politics and social systems that all just sort of suddenly wind back in time. If anything, it should be the technological advancements that suffer losses. Instead, we're meant to believe that space travel and eugenics and all of that stuff haven't suffered any losses and in fact have advanced in leaps and bounds. But for some reason, humanity has suffered the loss of becoming medieval again. It's clear that most things in this story are meant to have real-world parallels, and that's what Frank Herbert intended. We'll talk about Frank Herbert's intentions and how they've been made so bloody obvious in part 2, but for now let's just go through the intended parallels. The religion in this story is largely based on Islam and Islamic culture, sprinkled in with maybe a bit of Buddhist philosophy. The main villain in this story, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, is clearly the stereotype of a cool, calculating, mafia-esque Russian dude. The natives of the planet Arrakis or Dune, who are called the Freemen, are meant to represent the Bedouin people. They're nomadic, and their culture is clearly inspired by Arab culture. And of course, the spice equals modern-day oil and perhaps some other valuable resources. But none of these parallels make the book relatable or relevant, and they're not even done well. And the fact that there are too many of these parallels means that only the surface of each is scratched and comes off like a lazy cobbling together of topics that Frank Herbert happened to be interested in while he was writing the book. The world building is what everyone loves, right? Yeah, I'm very confused by that. There are some cute elements, such as the ecology and social customs derived from the ecology. For example, it's pretty neat how a severe lack of water results in a completely different set of social norms from what we're familiar with. The idea of having to extract water and moisture from things we completely take for granted is pretty well constructed in the book, and the steel suits and chromoplastic dew collectors are very cute, very clever concepts. But that's as far as I can gush about. The rest of the world building? Absolutely lazy. All of the jargon is this kind of pseudo-Arabic, and the Freemen, the natives on planet Dune, constantly make some kind of indignant Muslim-sounding declaration and a swell of religious fanaticism, and it's clear that Frank Herbert writes the culture of these people as stagnant and has been stagnant for thousands of years. So, racism, check. Okay, maybe their culture is just super resistant to change, don't judge. Well then, how come they seem susceptible to change only when an imperialist, or in other words, a colonizer, trots along and makes those changes? Imperialism, check. For instance, Paul, our main character, not long after coming into contact with one of these Freeman tribes, gets challenged to a duel to the death. And of course, our 15-year-old protagonist manages to win, and basically murders this experienced Freeman fighter who was oh so silly enough to challenge a teenage boy. Now, the Freemen are said to have a lot of traditional practices that perhaps foreigners, aka our white-coded protagonists, don't fully understand, and quite frankly, it doesn't seem like these white-coded people very much care to understand more. After all, like I just said, one of the very few practices that they actually did honor required our white main character guy Paul to kill a Freeman and take his wife and servants as battle spoils, and that was all done in the guise of respecting the Freeman's traditional customs. Even the ideas of how to utilize the conserved water and potentially make the desert planet Arrakis into less of a desert had to be introduced to the Freeman by Kynes, a planetologist or ecologist who isn't a native. Everything about the way the Freemen are characterized suggests they are of lesser intelligence and require the leadership of someone from imperial origins in order to advance. And that the people from Atreides, the white-coded people, are able to see the world, or worlds, multiple, with a wider, much wider political perspective that the Freeman leaders most certainly could not have done themselves. More on this later. Okay, so far nothing sounds particularly modern, so why are people calling this book highly relevant to contemporary times? Well, it's the themes, of course. One can't do a book review on Dune without harping on about the themes. Here are some of them. Environmental degradation, political corruption and exploitive power, colonialism, religious fanaticism, leadership fanaticism, etc., etc. Now, I'm going to posit that most of these are not actually new concepts, and the only reason they appear to remain relevant 50 years later is because they've always been relevant. People of the present always consider themselves as the most important, the most progressive, the most relevant, when really history just constantly repeats itself and similarities can be found era to era. And much like in real life, the issues presented in Dune don't become resolved. Perhaps they do become resolved later on in the series. I've only read the first book, but so far it is only making the observation that these themes, these issues, exist. Colonialism exists, environmental degradation exists, political corruption exists. Not only do our characters, including the main characters, play into these problems, but they actively contribute to them, never properly acknowledging their shortcomings. And these are the characters we're meant to be rooting for? The characters themselves are bland, stereotypical, and one-dimensional. Perhaps it's because, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt, because Frank Herbert intended for this to be a series-long story from the very start, and that's why the characters are given so little development in the first book. But even so, the first book just doesn't do a good job of encouraging me to invest even more time into the rest of the series, and I'm actually contradicting myself here because there is character development that happens. It's just that any major character development only happens behind the scenes, which means the reader is just meant to accept the sudden changes that occur to any of our main characters because that's just the natural progression of how this very predictable plot shall unfold. So I'm going to do a run through of a few notable mentions before I talk about Paul, the main character, whom I have a lot to say about. the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, our resident villain who is overweight and super duper evil. He sees his family only as chess pieces to be maneuvered around so as to solidify his own position of power, and he feels zero sympathy for anyone save for himself. Oh, and by the way, he's also gay and a pedophile. So, it absolutely just disgusts me that when I was researching for the general thoughts on this, I found people excusing this little detail as a flippant mention or mentioned as an afterthought in the book. If anything, it was just an afterthought, and him being gay is not supposed to be an integral part of his character. He just happened to be gay. Frank Herbert held no ill intentions, he just wanted to characterize the villain as utterly despicable. So we don't see any problems with this? I was also finding it incredulous that this detail is being overlooked in so many of the reviews gushing about this book. Okay, so, if we even require this to be broken down in the year 2021. First of all, if it's not meant to be an integral part of his character, well, why make him gay then? Why make the main villain the only gay or LGBT plus character in your book? And of course, there are people saying we need to keep in mind the time period and the historical context of when this was written. Okay, that makes it sound like this was from ancient history. 1965 was when it was published. Not the most progressive, forward-thinking, accepting time, but not the worst either. So do with that information what you will. Either way, I don't think it excuses the choice that Frank Herbert made to make his main villain gay, and it definitely doesn't excuse the choice that fans of the book have made to consistently overlook this blatant homophobia. And the fact that it's an afterthought, if anything, just makes it even worse. Now it just means the writer is being flippantly, casually homophobic without even realizing it. From what I can tell, he is the only gay character written into this book. Correct me if I'm wrong, if I've overlooked anything. But if that is the case, which is just, on top of all the theatrics and the just dramatically dripping with evil that the Baron is, that's just the final nail in the coffin, sealing him as the stereotypical one-dimensional Disney villain with the added bonus of reinforcing homophobic rhetoric. Which, actually, we know that Disney hasn't exactly shied away from that either, so really, the Baron is just straight out of Disney. The Bene Gesserit and the Mentats. I'm aware people pronounce it Gesserit. I don't care. I like Gesserit. Bite me. We've talked about racism, we've talked about homophobia, now we can't miss it. Misogyny. And just a very binary, rigid, and gross way of considering gender and reinforcing negative stereotypes. The Bene Gesserit are almost exclusively women, and they do things like mind control and manipulation, and they fit neatly into the categorical tropes of the maiden, the mother, and the crone. They hold the important character roles of the guiding mother, the cautious wife and/or concubine, and are measured in value by their capacity to bear and rear children. In fact, the Bene Gesserit has this intense breeding program, which Jessica went against by giving birth to a son rather than a daughter, as she was told to do. More on this later. The Mentats, on the other hand, are logical. They're driven by facts and knowledge and logic and wisdom, and are basically the supercomputers who have replaced computers, because remember, death of all computers. They are the advisors of the higher-ups, and of course they are exclusively men. Mentat. It has the word men in the name. I know this could be like a derivation from mental or mentality or something like that to do with the brain, but come on, it's pretty funny. In fact, I'm surprised this whole book is not just a parody of popular cringeworthy tropes that have managed to last a century. Mentats, Jesus Christ. Additionally, the men who aren't Mentats, they fight, wage battles, go to war, they make important decisions, they rule kingdoms and dukedoms and all sorts of domes. You get the point. As if all of this binary division of male and female isn't blatant enough, towards the end of the book, Paul manages to come to a revelation that man equals taker and woman equals giver. More on this later. So, that finally brings us to Paul, the subverted chosen one. Oh, sorry, gotta be careful with this one. Quote unquote, chosen one. Now, everyone loves to proclaim how Paul isn't the chosen one, and we don't care what you say, he just isn't, okay? He's subverted, he's different, he didn't want to be the chosen one, he wasn't even supposed to be chosen. The thing is though, just because he didn't want to be the chosen one, or he wasn't supposed to be the chosen one from the very start, none of that negates the fact that he is. For Dune, the book, I argue that he is the chosen one, and here is why. Number 1. He has been trained both as a Mentat and as a Bene Gesserit. Remember how I said Bene Gesserit equals female and Mentat equals male? Well, Paul is better than the binary. He is both. Here is a brilliant opportunity for some nice non-binary representation, but of course that's too much to ask for from the mid-1900s, so of course didn't expect that. It just would have been nice and surprising and nice. But the point is, being trained in both the Mentat and Bene Gesserit traditions effectively makes him a super soldier with a supercomputer for a head. How is this not... How do people not see this as precise chosen one material? Anyway, number 2. This training makes him prophetic and able to predict the future. This power is only heightened by being exposed to the spice on planet Dune, and this spice, I have so much to say about this lovely, lovely spice, but I already said I wasn't going to critique a soft magic system, so I shall let it rest. What I shan't let rest though is how this spice has made him an unrivaled military strategist. Never mind that the spice affects everyone on the planet, Paul is still matchless. This could be easily fixed if books later on showcase the downsides to this prophetic power, and for all I know, they probably do. But I'm just critiquing the first book, and the first book only hints that such prophetic powers are dangerous without actually showing how they can be, which just seems like a cop-out way of giving Paul something difficult he needs to handle, but not actually having any difficulty exist. Number 3. He's forced to leave his environment of familiarity due to adversity, and re-emerges a couple of years and one time skip later as our renewed leader of a resistance group, father of a child, combat-trained, immensely overpowered protagonist. So, this goes into what I was saying earlier about how there is no effective character development other than that happens behind the scenes. When Paul re-emerged after the time skip, I felt like it was meant to be this grand reveal. Like, I felt like there was something missing and I didn't get that emotional impact. And I finally figured out what it is. Paul just doesn't struggle. Or at least we're not shown that he struggles. There's a whole thing about how he feels sad for the Freeman he has slain earlier on, but since then he has just integrated so well into Freeman culture that there's no residue of that at all. And because he has already set the precedent for weeping, the idea of giving up precious water for the dead after he had killed that Freeman, when anyone else does it afterwards, weeping for the dead, they're not seen as revolutionary and selfless because, of course, only our main character guy, Paul, can be this revolutionary and this selfless. Number 4. Wait, I said Paul integrated so well into Freeman culture? No, I take that back. He has overtaken Freeman culture. Plot-wise, it makes absolutely no freaking sense that he's able to survive and rise to prominence in a society so different from his own, unless the writer is saying that Paul's background and cultural practices are superior to the Freeman's and have a lot to offer in terms of colonization. There is this one counter-argument for Paul being the chosen one that I can think of, and that is that Paul is not really the savior for the Freeman people, since not everything he does is favorable to them. Things he's introducing are in fact directly eradicating their culture and replacing it with an imperial one, and it can even be argued that he's directly exploiting the Freeman to achieve his own goals, which means he's not a chosen one savior for the Freeman, not at all. But I do maintain that he is the chosen one savior for Atreides, and that is what the book focuses on. Not the Freeman, but Atreides, and only looks towards the Freeman through the lens of the Atreides and whenever it's necessary for the two groups to interact. Number 5. As a Bene Gesserit in training, he commands the voice, and it's the voice with a capital V, which is basically mind control. Anything he says with this voice forces the receiver of the command to obey. It's framed as a power that's wielded by only the most sensible, righteous people, and understandably so. We wouldn't want that to be exploited. And his mother, Jessica, uses this very sparingly. Very, very sparingly, to the point where some of the major complications of the book seem contrived, because Jessica is so powerful, how is she not able to see this coming? How come she didn't use her extensive wisdom and foresight and all the powers she has to prevent this awful thing from happening? Well, obviously, because then the plot wouldn't have any complications. More on the plot in part 2. Anyway, so how is Paul qualified to use this voice? Well, he's not. At least it feels like he's not. It feels like he hasn't gone through any rites of passage to get where he is. At the start of the book, there's this test where he sticks his hand in a box of pain, but that wasn't for some sort of rite of passage. That was to show if he was prepared to be what all the prophecies proclaim him to be. It was meant to test if his awareness can be stronger than his animal instincts, which would obviously be to retract his hand from a box of pain. If anything, this only solidifies how chosen one he is, and doesn't actually do anything to show that he's prepared to take on some of the heaviest responsibilities of this world, other than that was symbolic. The pain from the box felt like it was symbolic of all the pain he could have experienced from the greater outside world, if the book would have just let him experience it. But it just felt like it was all condensed into these few and far between tests, which is exactly what a lot of chosen ones experience. And how chosen one is he? Yes, I'm starting to use chosen one as an adjective at this point. Well, he's so chosen one that of course he wasn't going to retract his hand, of course he was going to endure the pain and overcome the pain, and of course he was going to pass the test. And the audience expected for this to be the case. The box of pain was an initiation thing. It wasn't a qualification thing. It initiated him into the rite of passage as a chosen one, as a very lazily written chosen one at that. It didn't qualify him to be this grand savior of the world. And as a Bene Gesserit in training, he's just so freaking rude to his mother, which just ticked me the wrong way. You're only a Bene Gesserit in training, how do you know more than Jessica, you pubescent teenage boy? This doesn't have anything to do with the chosen one or to subvert a chosen one trope, just what a bratty edgelord of a child, my goodness. I can only recall one instance when Jessica actually calls him out on being so insolent, and well, maybe the fault's on Jessica then. The fact that she didn't educate or raise him to be this kind-hearted, polite boy that he was supposed to be. But anyway, I can only recall one instance when Jessica actually calls out how insolent Paul's being, and it was on page 544 of the SF Masterworks edition. Here's a quote. "Was that their plan?" Jessica said. "Isn't it obvious?" Paul asked. "I see the signs," Jessica snapped. "My question was meant to remind you that you should not try to teach me those matters in which I instructed you." Paul glanced at her, caught a cold smile on her lips. Earlier, I mentioned that one of the arguments people give for Paul not being the chosen one is that he doesn't admit to being the chosen one. Let's just ignore the fact that there have been plenty of chosen ones throughout the history of chosen ones who deny themselves being the chosen one or treat the whole idea with disbelief. Because even without knowing that, if the only book you've ever read is Dune, first of all, I pity you, and second of all, Paul himself backtracks on that, and later on admits that he is the chosen one. Page 534 of the SF Masterworks edition, featuring some disrespect towards his mother because it's hard to have an interaction between them towards the latter half of the book without Paul being rude to Jessica. "You must understand that she does this out of kindness," he said. "Isn't it odd how we misunderstand the hidden unity of kindness and cruelty?" Jessica glared at her son, shocked by the profound change in him. Was it his child's death did this? She wondered. And she said, "The men tell strange stories of you, Paul. They say you've all the powers of the legend, nothing can be hidden from you, that you see where others cannot see. A Bene Gesserit should ask about legends?" he asked. "I've had a hand in whatever you are," she admitted, "but you mustn't expect me to. How would you like to live billions upon billions of lives?" Paul asked. "There's a fabric of legends for you. Think of all those experiences, the wisdom they bring. But wisdom tempers love, doesn't it? And it puts a new shape on hate. How can you tell what's ruthless unless you've plumbed the depths of both cruelty and kindness? You should fear me, Mother. I am the Kwisatz Haderach." Jessica tried to swallow in a dry throat. Presently she said, "Once you denied to me that you were the Kwisatz Haderach." Paul shook his head. "I can deny nothing anymore." Ugh, just so condescending towards his mother, my goodness. Also notice how Paul often speaks in this overly philosophical way that just doesn't feel realistic at all. Nobody speaks like this, least of all a teenage boy. Perhaps you could argue, oh, this is just what Frank Herbert envisions people in the distant future to sound like. Well, what could be the reason for that, other than to forward the narrative and have it be really convenient to explain the story to the dumb reader who can't possibly understand nuance? And here also, Paul just goes off again, talking about the unity between kindness and cruelty. He's always depicted as the unity between two binaries, or being one of the rare few to realize a unity between binaries. It's just Get out of here. And while we're quoting things, remember how I complained about the binary man equals taker, woman equals giver revelation that Paul managed to come to? Well, here it is. Hear it for yourself. Page 505. Jessica shook her head. Paul said, "There is in each of us an ancient force that takes and an ancient force that gives. A man finds little difficulty facing that place within himself where the taking force dwells, but it's almost impossible for him to see into the giving force without changing into something other than man. For a woman, the situation is reversed." Jessica looked up, found Chani was staring at her while listening to Paul. "Do you understand me, Mother?" Paul asked. She could only nod. Okay, sorry. I must stop here. She could only nod? Are you kidding me? Why? Why is she always depicted as being so meek towards her own son? This is ridiculous. Anyway, she could only nod. Alright. "These things are so ancient within us," Paul said, "that they're ground into each separate cell of our bodies. We're shaped by such forces. You can say to yourself, yes, I see how such a thing may be. But when you look inward and confront the raw force of your own life unshielded, you see your peril. You see that this could overwhelm you. The greatest peril to the giver," and giver is written with a capital G here, and later on taker will be written with a capital T. "The greatest peril to the giver is the force that takes. The greatest peril to the taker is the force that gives. It's as easy to be overwhelmed by giving as by taking." "And you, my son?" Jessica asked. "Are you one who gives or one who takes?" "I'm the fulcrum," he said. "I cannot give without taking, and I cannot take without..." He broke off, looking to the wall at his right. Are you kidding me? Okay, sorry. I'll minimize my commentary on this. I think you get the point. I will say though, nothing really prompted him into launching into this speech either. Like, the transitions in this novel are terrible sometimes. So, in conclusion, if anything, Paul is just an edgier version of the traditional Chosen One trope. And, I mean, most Chosen Ones are quite edgy already, so he's going above and beyond. There's also the argument that Frank Herbert himself intended for Paul to not be the Chosen One, and, I mean, that doesn't mean anything other than that, well, he failed in his intentions, I guess. And the real Chosen One, since I have no problems with Chosen Ones being in stories, they can be well executed. If there were to be a Chosen One, the real Chosen One should have been Jessica. I rest my case. No, that's a lie. I don't rest my case. I'm still partway through part 1. This is going to take forever, isn't it? Now, I'm going to take a breather from this constant negativity, and I'm going to give credit where credit is due. There is this really, really cute concept that has been introduced about how the Bene Gesserit, generations ago, planted these fake prophecies among the people. And they do this so that they can bring security to future generations of Bene Gesserits who might align with those prophecies and, because of that, be afforded protection by those who might otherwise want to kill them. Isn't that cute? So the prophecies themselves are fake, but they were planted there generations ago as a form of foresight on the Bene Gesserit's part to protect future generations of Bene Gesserits if they chance upon this tribe, for example, this Freeman tribe. Because the Freemen believe in the prophecy, they would, instead of killing them, actually afford them protection and take care of them to some extent. So it can be argued that the book is trying to say the whole Chosen One idea is actually a fake prophecy that the Bene Gesserit made up, in the hopes that they'll eventually manage to breed said Chosen One, or falling short of that, at least they'll have the protection of people thinking that certain members of their order are chosen, and are then able to bring some sort of salvation and hence not kill them. There is a problem with this though. I'm sorry, of course there's a problem with this. The fake prophecies, they're planted exclusively among the Freemen. We're not given any other examples where it's being used other than on the Freemen, and it just makes the Freemen look bad. It makes them look dumb and gullible. So, halfway through, and I'm aware that I'm bound to be criticised of retroactively accusing some decades-old book of being politically incorrect. Let me just preemptively say to that, nothing is exempt. I'm happy, very happy, to accuse anything of being politically incorrect, or even of being too politically correct that it ruins the story. All I care about is the story, I'm simply explaining why I'm not a huge fan of this particular story and why this particular story was unenjoyable for me. So, okay, we're going to veer more into the storytelling realm of things very, very soon, and we're going to leave the political stuff for now. So, storytelling critique coming right up. Part 2. It's long, weary, and dreary. The story, as I've said, is very mediocre, bordering on bad with just how boring and predictable it is. So, up to this point, I haven't really said much on the plot. That's because for people who have already read the story, obviously they would know the plot, and for those who haven't already read the story, it's just uninteresting to talk about. Look up any review of the book online, and it appears that people agree on this point that, they're all talking about how subversive Paul is as a main character and all the all-encompassing themes, but not really on the plot. So the plot can be easily cut up into 3 segments, let's say. So number 1, Paul was supposed to be a baby girl, but his mother defied what was expected of her and conceived a boy. And again, it just strikes me that non-binary representation would have been so very cool, but I get it, mid to late 1900s United States was nowhere near that level. But I don't know, I'm also reminded of authors such as Ursula Le Guin, who did toy with such ideas. Now, that's a truly sci-fi author. Sorry, what am I talking about? Paul. So he was born, and he was a blank slate. And he remained a blank slate for much of his life. Arguably all of his life, but that's another point. That was the first segment. Second segment. So, someone betrayed someone, people died, and Paul and Jessica became lost in the desert and are picked up by Freeman. This was also when Paul murdered one of the Freemen, quite promptly, because he was challenged to a duel to the death, and he gave up precious water for the dead guy he killed himself, and everyone started looking at him with some level of reverence because, oh my goodness, he gave up his precious bodily fluids for somebody who is dead and can't use the water. Like, it's a cute concept, sure, but it's just the way it's executed was a little bit... Anyway, number 3, third segment. There was a time skip, and by the end of the book, by book 3 basically, because the book is cut up into 3 parts. Okay, by book 3, our main character guy, Paul, is magically invincible. So he has the powers of both Duke and Muad'Dib, and when his authority is restricted by one, he can exercise in the name of the other. And here's a quote from that. So this is on page 545 of the SF Masterworks edition. The Emperor's smile was calculating. Anyone accepted into the Imperial Company is a member of my entourage. You have the word of a duke, Paul said, but Muad'Dib is another matter. He may not recognize your definition of what constitutes an entourage. My friend Gurney Halleck wishes to kill a Harkonnen if he... And then it's cut off by another character. So here, basically what Paul is saying is he agrees as Duke, but he doesn't agree as Muad'Dib. And this sort of wishy-washy flip-flopping between 2 identities, it's very strange. It doesn't really go with everything else he's been saying so far. We have seen how much he's into the whole unity thing. Well, now he's splitting up his personality, and it's quite bizarre. I also said that by the end of the book he's magically invincible, and I say magically because that's really what it feels like. After this magical time lapse of 2 years by book 3, Paul is just invincible, without it ever really being shown how this all happened. He is now the leader of a newly organised fighting commando with the powers of both male and female, apparently, and having fulfilled the prophecy with no hiccups. As we've already covered, it's clear that Frank Herbert intended for this to be a subversion of the Chosen One trope. And this is through the jihad. I'm going to try to explain the jihad now. So Paul is supposed to be a peaceful messiah, or the whole time he's trying to be a peaceful messiah, but resulting in a seemingly inevitable jihad because he's able to see into the future and he sees that this holy war won't be avoided. And that's all fine and dandy, but it's very poorly executed. This inevitable jihad feels like this looming thing in the distance, but we're never really... This is just the classic case of telling and not showing. We're never really shown if there's anything wrong or anything brewing in the distance. And, there's nothing wrong with telling rather than showing on its own, per se. But when it's overdone, I tend to think the story itself might be unsuited for the novel form. Because the novel is very, very well adapted to showing the audience what's going on rather than telling straight up. So we're told that this jihad cannot be avoided through Paul's own perspective, but he's going to try anyway because he's supposed to be the peaceful messiah. And he gathers up all these great warriors of the desert, the Freeman tribes, and creates a troop, invincible troop basically, out of these Freeman people. And I have this whole spiel on how just because they're good at surviving in the desert, it doesn't mean that they have good man-to-man combat ability, but that's a very minor gripe compared to a lot of the other ones I have. They can be both, it's just the fact that Herbert seems to lump them together, and the Freemen are supposed to be these survival warriors as well as combative ones. But the problem is, these troops seem to be bordering on fanaticism rather than simply loyalty or camaraderie or whatever it is. And this is supposed to show that Frank Herbert never intended for this to be a chosen one situation. Rather, that creating his own cult of personality, Paul is the subverted chosen one. Problem with this is he's not depicted to have any grief over this. He just goes along with it and he's shown to be successful at the end. He rises to his position of dukedom, and Muad'Dib, which is a whole other thing which I won't get into too much because there's too much to talk about there. But the end of the book shows him to be successful after having created a cult of personality. So instead of, warning against fanaticism, religious or otherwise, he's shown to use fanaticism to his advantage. And just judging by the story itself, it is surprisingly one of the most YA-esque, self-aggrandizing stories I've read this year. People who herald Dune are, from what I've observed, the same people who look down upon the particular popular young adult dystopian novels without realizing that Dune is exactly what they hate, just with a bit more flourish in language, which I can also appreciate. It was quite philosophical at times, which were like little boosters that helped me get through the book, these flourishes in language. But Paul was just so freaking Mary Sue, to the point where it felt like a fanfic self-insert at times. I mean, he ends up with 2 wives, for God's sake. Here's the quote towards the very end of the book from the last 2 pages that was kind of going into that whole thing, trying to philosophize the idea that he has 2 wives, but really he's just ending up... Anyway, here's a quote. "What of the Freemen?" Jessica asked. "The Freemen are mine," Paul said. "What they receive shall be dispensed by Muad'Dib. It'll begin with Stilgar as governor on the Arrakis, but that can wait." "And for me?" Jessica asked. "Is there something you wish?" "Perhaps Caladan," she said, looking at Gurney. "I'm not certain. I've become too much the Freeman and the Reverend Mother. I need a time of peace and stillness in which to think." "That you shall have," Paul said, "and anything else that Gurney or I can give you." Jessica nodded, feeling suddenly old and tired. She looked at Chani. "And for the royal concubine?" "No title for me," Chani whispered. "Nothing, I beg of you." Paul stared down into her eyes, remembering her suddenly as she had stood once with little Leto in her arms, their child now dead in this violence. "I swear to you now," he whispered, "that you will need no title. That woman over there," will be my wife, and you but a concubine, because this is a political thing, and we must weld peace out of this moment. Enlist the great houses of the Landsrat. We must obey the forms. Yet that princess shall have no more of me than my name, no child of mine, nor touch, nor softness of glance, nor instant of desire. So you say now, Chani said. She glanced across the room at the tall princess. Do you know so little of my son? Jessica whispered. See that princess standing there, so haughty and confident. They say she has pretensions of a literary nature. Let us hope she finds solace in such things. She'll have little else. A bitter laugh escaped Jessica. Think on it, Chani. That princess will have the name, yet she'll live as less than a concubine, never to know a moment of tenderness from the man to whom she's bound. While we, Chani, we who carry the name of concubine, history will call us wives. And that was the note the book left me on. I did read the appendices before finishing book 3, so that was literally the last bit of Dune that I read. And just how gross, how absolutely foul. It was disgusting. I don't know how this the misogyny, it's rampant here. It's so obvious, it's so blatant. And it just appears that Herbert can't write any normal humans. It just doesn't feel normal. It feels it's conceptual. All the humans here are conceptual. They're not real. It's very bizarre. And most of the book felt like this, taking really shallow and quite misogynistic ideas and dressing it up in fluffy philosophy to make it sound deep and profound, which made the book just taste bad. And from the few extracts that I've read, you pretty much already know what the tone of Dune is like the whole way through. The way the book was formatted didn't help matters either. There aren't really any chapters, which makes the whole thing feel like it's just one long ramble. The book itself is separated into 3 parts, book 1, book 2, and book 3, as I've already mentioned. But the book itself is so long that if you consider those as chapters, you're basically considering the size of a full-length novel as a chapter. There are some separators though, and those can arguably be considered the separators for the chapters, but those aren't numbered chapters. Instead, they come in the form of quotes, mostly from this Princess Irulan, who's the princess that Paul must marry for political reasons at the very end of the book, and whom the other women in Paul's life, particularly Jessica, was being incredibly condescending towards. Just the peak of internalized misogyny right there. And Princess Irulan is supposedly writing sometime in the future the history of Paul Muad'Dib and the events surrounding him. But the history of Paul Muad'Dib is precisely the story that we're reading in the present. And the effect of this is that before each chapter, I suppose you could call it a chapter, we've already received a spoiler of what's to happen in the chapter coming up. Admittedly, sometimes they probably can't be considered absolute spoilers because of how cryptic it is, how cryptic it's been phrased, and in those cases it's probably a bit more like foreshadowing rather than spoiling some major plot points. But there were still many major plot points that were spoiled way in advance. The worst part of this is not that I find anything inherently wrong with spoilers. In fact, I don't mind spoilers most of the time. I maintain my belief that if it's a good story, having the ending or some major plot twist spoiled doesn't ruin the story itself, because you'd still be interested in knowing how the story got to that point. You're still invested. There's still more of the story to discover. It's not reliant on some big twist to be a worthwhile story. So what is the problem then? The problem with these spoilers or previews or bits of foreshadowing or whatever else you want to call it, the problem with these is that it completely undermines the characters themselves. Since it's been made so obvious to the reader is put in a position to feel as if the characters, particularly those who have been depicted as being highly intelligent, powerful, and intuitive, aka Jessica, also a few others, but mostly Jessica, we feel as if the characters are suddenly uncharacteristically dumb for not seeing what's supposedly right in front of their noses. Specifically, I'm thinking about the major betrayal that launched everything into action, which was spoiled as early as page 29, when the betrayal itself doesn't happen until somewhere close to page 200. Observe. You have read that Muad'Dib had no playmates his own age on Caladan. The dangers were too great. But Muad'Dib did have wonderful companion teachers. There was Gurney Halleck, the troubadour warrior. You will sing some of Gurney's songs as you read along in this book. There was Thufa Hawat, the old Mentat master of assassins, who struck fear even into the heart of the Padisha emperor. There were Duncan Idaho, the swordmaster of the Ginars, Dr. Wellington Yue, a name black in treachery but bright in knowledge, the Lady Jessica, who guided her son in the Bene Gesserit way, and, of course, the Duke Leto, whose qualities as a father have long been overlooked. Note the part about Dr. Wellington Yue, a name black in treachery. Right? Alright, so this is from one of the earlier chapter separators, and they're all formatted in this indented, slightly smaller font. And here, on page 40, it was just explicitly said that Yue is the traitor. From Dictionary of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan, Yue Wellington, chiefly noted as betrayer of Duke Leto Atreides, and under betrayal, the. So, they literally just spelling it out here. And then Frank Herbert just tossed away any possibly remaining remnants of subtlety just in case the reader didn't get the point and did this. From A Child's History of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan, "Yeah," goes the refrain, "a million deaths were not enough for Yue." Now, this is actually making Yue sound really evil, but surprise, he's actually one of the few characters whose motivations kind of actually make sense, and he's not just a one-dimensional villain. So, his motivations for betraying Duke Leto was because he wanted to get revenge on the Baron Harkonnen for murdering his wife, and the Duke was the only person who'd, if he was restrained, be brought close enough to the Baron to be able to kill him on a suicide mission. So Yue orchestrated the capture of the Duke, planted a poisonous fake tooth in his mouth, so that when the Duke is wheeled in to meet the Baron, once he's close enough, he'll bite on that tooth, which will release a poisonous gas that would kill everyone in the vicinity, including the Baron. So, this little extract actually shows how inaccurate records of history can be, which in itself is quite an interesting idea. But this idea is just sort of left to the wayside and not really brought back with other extracts from Princess Irulan's history book. And on the same pages that I've just shown, you also see how the third-person omniscient narration is used, with italics on almost any given page, which tells us what each character is thinking in response to something happening. And sometimes this kind of predictability, being able to be privy to each character's thoughts, can be quite refreshing, and the italics can be quite helpful and serve as some fun, dramatic irony. But most of the time, they were excessive, repetitive, and you just can't get away from them. Flip open to any page and chances are you'll find at least one line of italics on the page. Here's an example of the italics making it so blatantly obvious to the point of tedium. There's hope as well as danger here. The spice could make us rich. With a fat treasury we can make this world into whatever we wish. And she laughed silently at herself. Who am I trying to convince? The laugh broke through her restraints, emerging brittle, without humour. But you can't buy security, she said. Yue turned away to hide his face from her. If only it were possible to hate these people instead of love them. In her manner, in many ways, Jessica was like his Wana. Yet that thought carried its own rigours, hardening him to his purpose. The ways of the Harkonnen cruelty were devious. Wana might not be dead. He had to be certain. Do not worry for us, Wellington, Jessica said. The problem's ours, not yours. She thinks I worry for her. He blinks back tears. And I do, of course. But I must stand before that Black Baron with his deed accomplished and take my one chance to strike him then when he is weakest, in his gloating moment. He sighed. And here's what I mean by, what the hell is Jessica doing? How is she so oblivious to Yue's intentions? She can literally read minds if she so chooses. How is it that she's so blindsided in this particular instance? The only reason I can think of is for it to allow the plot to advance, which, come on, that just doesn't cut it. On the same page, it reads that Yue gave Paul a sedative. He literally sedated your sons. Why are alarm bells not ringing? And these little italicized asides just widens the gap further between what the audience knows and what the characters know, making the characters just seem incapable. This ignorance and obliviousness continues way after the betrayal actually happens, so all these main players of the dukedom are now scattered all over Dune, and they're still questioning who the hell betrayed them. The funniest part I can think of, where the italics were used excessively to the point that it was ridiculous, was when Kynes was left out in the desert to die. and he started having hallucinations of his father holding a conversation with him. The whole thing was dragged out so much, it spanned across 8 pages. Don't worry, I won't read out the whole thing, but here is some of it. The man stopped half across the dune crest, arms stretched down the slip face. Blood had clotted on his back and on his arms and legs. Patches of yellow-grey sand clung to the wounds. Slowly, he brought his hands under him, pushed himself to his feet, stood there swaying. And even in this almost random action, there remained a trace of once precise movement. "I am Liet Kynes," he said, addressing himself to the empty horizon, and his voice was a hoarse caricature of the strength it had known. He stumbled, fell sideways along the crusty surface of the windward face, his hands dug feebly into the sand. "I am steward of this sand," he thought. He realized that he was semi-delirious, that he should dig himself into the sand, find the relatively cool underlayer, and cover himself with it. But he could still smell the rank, semi-sweet esters of a pre-spice pocket somewhere underneath this sand. He knew the peril within this fact more certainly than any other freeman. If he could smell the pre-spice mass, that meant the gases deep under the sand were nearing explosive pressure. He had to get away from here. His hands made weak, scrabbling motions along the dune face. A thought spread across his mind, clear, distinct. The real wealth of a planet is in its landscape, how we take part in that basic source of civilization, agriculture. And he thought how strange it was that his mind, long fixed on a single track, could not get off that track. The Harkonnen troopers had left him here without water or stillsuit, thinking a worm would get him if the desert didn't. They had thought it amusing to leave him alive to die by inches at the impersonal hands of his planet. The Harkonnens always did find it difficult to kill Freeman, he thought. We don't die easily. I should be dead now. I will be dead soon. But I can't stop being an ecologist. The highest function of ecology is understanding consequences. The voice shocked him because he recognized it and knew the owner of it was dead. It was the voice of his father, who had been planetologist here before him. His father long dead, killed in the cave-in at Plaster Basin. "Got yourself in quite a fix here, son," his father said. "You should have known the consequences of trying to help the child of that duke." "I'm delirious," Kynes thought. The voice seemed to come from his right. Kynes scraped his face through the sand, turning to look in that direction. Nothing except a curving stretch of dune dancing with heat devils in the full glare of the sun. "The more life there is within a system, the more niches there are for life," his father said. And the voice came now from his left, from behind him. "Why does he keep moving around?" Kynes asked himself. "Doesn't he want me to see him?" "Life improves the capacity of the environment to sustain life," his father said. "Life makes needed nutrients more readily available. It binds more energy into the system through the tremendous chemical interplay from organism to organism." Why does he keep harping on the same subject? Kynes asked himself. "I knew that before I was 10. "We are generalists," his father said. "You can't draw neat lines around planet-wide problems. Planetology is a cut-and-fit science." What's he trying to tell me? Kynes wondered. Is there some consequence I failed to see? From some corner of logic in his mind, a thought formed. Those are carrion-eater birds over me. Perhaps some of my freemen will see them and come to investigate. To the working planetologist, his most important tool is human beings, his father said. You must cultivate ecological literacy among the people. That's why I've created this entirely new form of ecological notation. He's repeating things he said to me when I was a child, Kynes thought. The presence of moisture in the air helps prevent too rapid evaporation from living bodies, his father said. Why does he keep repeating the obvious? Kynes wondered. He tried to think of moisture in the air, grass covering this dune, open water somewhere beneath him. Our first goal on Arrakis, his father said, is grassland provinces. We will start with these mutated poverty grasses. When we have moisture locked in grasslands, we'll move on to start upland forests, then a few open bodies of water, small at first, and situated along lines of prevailing winds with wind-trapped moisture precipitators spaced in the lines to recapture what the wind steals. We will never get away from the necessity for wind traps. Always lecturing me, Kynes thought. Why doesn't he shut up? Can't he see I'm dying? You will die too, his father said, if you don't get off the bubble that's forming right now deep underneath you. It's there and you know it. You can smell the pre-spiced gases. You know the little makers are beginning to lose some of their water into the mass. Lines of movement adjust to physical needs for water, food, minerals. We must control this movement now. Align it for our purposes. Shut up, old man, Kynes muttered. We must do a thing on a ruckus never before attempted for an entire planet, his father said. We must use man as a constructive ecological force, inserting adapted terraform life, a plant here, an animal there, a man in that place, to transform the water cycle, to build a new kind of landscape. Shut up, Kynes croaked. It was lines of movement that gave us the first clue to the relationship between worms and spice, his father said. A worm, Kynes thought with a surge of hope. A maker is sure to come when this bubble bursts. But I have no hooks. How can I mount a big maker without hooks? He could feel frustration sapping what little strength remained to him. And the reader feels frustration sapping at what little patience remains. Frustration at how repetitive all of this is getting. This just keeps going. This doesn't stop. I've stopped, but this doesn't stop. Kynes keeps saying, please stop lecturing me, father, He could never stop lecturing, always lecturing. Yeah, this is starting to sound like a parody. Skip forward a little bit. I'm ignoring you, father, Kynes whispered. Go away. And he thought, surely there must be some of my freemen near. They cannot help but see the birds over me. They will investigate. But the father keeps going. Let them think anything they wish as long as they believe in us. In a minute, I'll get up and tell him what I think of him, Kynes thought, standing there lecturing me when he should be helping me. Why aren't you helping me? Kynes wondered. Always the same. When I need you most, you fail me. He wanted to turn his head, to stare in the direction of his father's voice, stare the old man down. Muscles refused to answer his demand. And then we have a bit of hope. Kynes saw the hawk move. It approached his hand, a cautious step at a time, while its companions waited in mock indifference. The hawk stopped only a hop away from his hand. A profound clarity filled Kynes' mind. He saw quite suddenly a potential for Arrakis that his father had never seen. The possibilities along that different path flooded through him. No more terrible disaster could befall your people than for them to fall into the hands of a hero, his father said. Reading my mind, Kynes thought. Well, let him. The messages already have been sent to my siege villages, he thought. Nothing can stop them. If the Duke's son is alive, they'll find him and protect him as I've commanded. They may discard the woman, his mother, but they'll save the boy. The hawk took one hop that brought it within slashing distance of his hand. It tipped its head to examine the supine flesh. Abruptly it straightened, stretched its head upward, and with a single screech, leaped into the air and banked away overhead with its companions behind it. They've come, Kynes thought. My freemen have found me. Then he heard the sand rumbling. And then, Kynes dies. So, all of that build-up was for naught. All of that back and forth between, Father, stop lecturing me. Father, lecture. Father, no, why aren't you helping me? Father, lecture. All of that was for nothing. There was no payoff to all the tedium. He came to some form of realization, but it never eventuated because he couldn't act on it, because he did. The italics and the little chapter separators were also used for lazy writing, telling instead of showing. Again, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with telling rather than showing where it's necessary to do so. Here, not only is it not necessary to do so, but it also undermines the intelligence of its audience and downplays the abilities of the characters when Frank Herbert is clearly trying to lift them up. For example, there were many times when the little chapter separators attempted to make the Duke Leto sound more intelligent and prepared than he actually was. It just sounds like Frank Herbert started out with this idea for this character to be wise and pioneering, and then forgot about it, and when he's too far into the story, he had to backtrack and add in all these little snippets into Princess Irulan's history book. I'm not saying that's actually what happened, but it felt like that when I was reading. It is said that the Duke Leto blinded himself to the perils of Arrakis, that he walked heedlessly into the pit. Would it not be more likely to suggest he had lived so long in the presence of extreme danger, he misjudged a change in its intensity? Or is it possible he deliberately sacrificed himself that his son might find a better life? All evidence indicates the Duke was a man not easily hoodwinked. No. Saying that all evidence indicates this without actually giving us that evidence just isn't very convincing, actually. Compare that to how he's actually described in the story, where he's just doing a lot of standing around, looking out into the distance. I mean, typical traits of a good leader, how would I know? Page 85, though. The Duke Leto Atreides leaned against the parapet of the landing control tower outside Arrakeen. The night's first moon, an oblate silver coin, hung well above the southern horizon. Beneath it, the jagged cliffs of the shield wall shone like parched icing through a dust haze. To his left, the lights of Arrakeen glowed in the haze, yellow, white, blue. Very nice description, though. Very atmospheric, very cute. He thought of the notices, posted now above his signature all through the populous places of the planet. Our sublime Padisha Emperor has charged me to take possession of this planet and end all dispute. The ritualistic formality of it touched him with a feeling of loneliness. Who was fooled by that fatuous legalism? Not the freemen, certainly, nor the houses minor who control the interior trade of Arrakis, and were Harkonnen creatures almost to a man. They have tried to take the life of my son. The rage was difficult to suppress. He saw lights of a moving vehicle coming toward the landing field from Arrakeen. He hoped it was the guard and troop carrier bringing Paul. The delay was galling, even though he knew it was prompted by caution on the part of Hawat's lieutenant. They have tried to take the life of my son. He shook his head to drive out the angry thoughts, glanced back at the field where 5 of his own frigates were posted around the rim like monolithic sentries. Better a cautious delay than... The lieutenant was a good one, he reminded himself. Now, just that last bit, see how that doesn't actually work. Better a cautious delay than ... and the lieutenant was a good one are both part of his own thoughts. So why have they been formatted differently? It just feels messy. And not because his own thoughts are messy and it's reflecting how his thoughts are messy. That has already been conveyed with the repeated "they have tried to take the life of my son" cutting through his own thoughts. It just feels messily put together. And going back to what I was saying, that is not evidence showing how smart the Duke is. He's not actually shown to be quite intelligent. He's just shown to be standing around most of the time, thinking about things, not really enacting many things, just ugh. And here's more telling rather than showing. Page 44. How do we approach the study of Muad'Dib's father? A man of surpassing warmth and surprising coldness was the Duke Leto Atreides. Yet many facts open the way to this Duke. His abiding love for his Bene Gesserit lady, the dreams he held for his son, the devotion with which men served him. You see him there, a man snared by destiny, a lonely figure with his light dimmed behind the glory of his son. Still, one must ask, what is the son but an extension of the father? Okay, well, that last bit, good point. But were we ever shown the traits Paul retained from his father? No, because Paul's such a blank slate. It's as if nobody can possibly ever rub off on him. He's so blank of a slate. And all the other facts, quote-unquote facts, listed out about the Duke, about how much he loved Jessica, the ambitions and expectations he had for Paul, etc., etc., they're not really facts just because you tell us they're facts and we can't find any substantial evidence for them being the case. And then there are some chapter separators that just sound like lazy poetry or just being fake deep. Take this, for example, on page 176. Do you wrestle with dreams? Do you contend with shadows? Do you move in a kind of sleep? Time has slipped away, your life is stolen, you tarried with trifles, victims of your folly. I don't know, not really much of a poem actually. It's just formatted like a poem, but really it's just a series of short questions and statements without much of a rhythm stringing them together. Or take this, for example. This is on page 76. What had the Lady Jessica to sustain her in her time of trial? Think you carefully on this Bene Gesserit proverb and perhaps you'll see. Any road followed precisely to its end leads precisely nowhere. Climb the mountain just a little bit to test that it's a mountain. From the top of the mountain, you cannot see the mountain. Ooh. I don't know, I feel like I can make something like this just off the top of my head. Okay, stand at the edge of the sea and look across the seas and you'll see that you're nothing but a seedling sunk into the soil, unable to appreciate the sea, this roiling menace. See? Frank Herbert also used a similar chapter separator format for his book Hellstrom's Hive, and I argue that the chapter separators are used much more effectively there. I won't go too much into it, it's not a Hellstrom's Hive review, but Hellstrom's Hive is about this group of people trained and raised under a sort of hive mentality, which was manifested into an entire project, and the project masterminds or initiators, they keep records of how the human hive is progressing year after year. On the other side of things, there are some agents, secret agents or government agents, whatever, who are investigating the farm where the hive is located at, and they want to put a stop to it, whatever they're doing. They're not really sure, they need to investigate it, because they believe that the hive people are manufacturing some kind of mass destruction weapon. So each of these chapter separators or headers or whatever you want to call them, they aren't from some spoilery history book written in the future, but snippets from either the hive's record keeping or the memos passed between the agents doing the investigations. And just in general, the story was better than Dune. It was very creepy and gripping, and I don't know, I would recommend it over Dune to anybody, any day. I think one thing that contributes to just how dull the story is actually its world building, or lack thereof. I've already mentioned in part 1 how superficial and insensitive the depictions of the cultures of the world are, and briefly how the ecology is interesting, but its potential hasn't been fully harnessed. Of course, aside from every second conversation revolving around the lack of water. But I think one word encapsulates how I felt about the world I was presented, or multiple worlds if you consider this an interplanetary adventure. And that is emptiness. The world felt empty, and somehow it astounds me that even that can be spun into something immensely positive by those gushing about Dune. The introduction to my copy of Hellstrom's Hive, also an SF Masterworks edition, is written by Adam Roberts and describes Dune thusly. Dune's wide open, barren spaces work as both topographic realization and also as metaphor. Specific enough, it has to do in some sense with Arabia and Islam, with climate change and also mysticism, not to be vague, but empty enough to provide an imaginative space that readers can feel with their own phantasmic creativity. It seems to me that the international success of the Dune books has something to do with a kind of imaginative spaciousness and an open-minded aesthetic particularly hospitable to fan engagement. So that just means, from what I can gather, the world is so empty that the fans of the book have to build the world themselves, impress their own theories and imagination onto this blank slate world. And I must draw that parallel to our main character buddy Paul. Blank slate character, right? For the fans of the book to more easily relate to, for a bit of fantasy escapism, but also for any random person to imprint themselves onto the main character because he's such a blank slate. But that's not actually how relatability in characters and storytelling works. It's actually paradoxically more relatable for the reader if the character has more specific traits that make up a personality. And the personality doesn't have to be exactly the same as the reader's for the reader to relate to them. It's much better if the reader can understand the character motivations which inform the decisions they make, rather than the reader not really understanding where the character is coming from because of how bland the character is. Same goes for the world building. The appendices in the book show us that there was so much to be experienced from this world, but so little was actually fitted into the actual story. The appendices didn't enhance my understanding of the world, they just made me frustrated as to why the information wasn't seamlessly integrated into the story for the reader to discover as they read along. Frank Herbert employs a very similar writing style in The Eyes of Heisenberg, which is a much shorter, cute little book, and despite it being much shorter, with my copy being less than 200 pages, it was a fully fleshed out, intriguing world where all the elements of the world felt necessary and the story feels like it just can't exist in any other world. We just don't have that with Dune, where the whole interplanetary thing felt a little redundant. It shouldn't be set on different planets in my opinion, when there is no point and the same story can be told if all the planets were just different countries. In The Eyes of Heisenberg, however, it would have been impossible to imagine the story taking place on any other world, under any other circumstances, in any other society, and indeed it wouldn't make any sense for the world to be changed in any way. Yes, Herbert still does have that annoying habit that he has in Dune of renaming every little thing to make it sound more sci-fi and futuristic without it actually making sense. For example, why would lights be renamed as glow tubes just because we're a few thousand years into the future? That was in both Dune and The Eyes of Heisenberg, I think. But these were minor annoyances considering how vast and extensive the world felt and how curious I felt whilst discovering more and more of it. And by the end of the book, I was left wanting more because it was so captivating. I did not feel that curiosity in exploring the world of Dune. I just felt an abundance of annoyance. Annoyance at the pseudo-Arabic jargon that seemed hollow and shallow and only used for aesthetic purposes to make the world appear more foreign and exotic to the average English speaker. Annoyance at the superficial elements that weren't entirely necessary to make the world building work, elements that managed to nudge it into the classification of sci-fi just because it happens to describe itself as futuristic. Annoyance that I had to read hundreds of pages of a story that could have been told entirely using the Princess Irulan quotes. Which, really, if we have the rest of the story, then those quotes were only there for aesthetic purposes. In The Eyes of Heisenberg, with no more than 200 pages, Frank Herbert managed to construct a world, establish the issues of this world, and reach a viable, pun intended for those who have read the book, conclusion. The pacing was precise, we were given characters with clear goals, the villains weren't evil for evil's sake, and the ending didn't feel rushed. In a short novel, we were given a complete story, a complete, interesting, and good story. I'm failing to understand what the hell happened with Dune and why the reception for it is so immensely positive and explosive to the point where other works of his have fallen to the wayside. Frank Herbert has better stuff and I urge everyone to check them out. And don't bother with Dune. Unless, of course, you want the status of having read it. Part 3. It doesn't deserve its status as classic sci-fi. Okay, we're going to take a little detour and talk about this rant I found on YouTube when I was searching for more opinions, trying to convince myself that Dune is great and all my misgivings are unfounded. Now, this video is actually ranting about how they didn't enjoy the book, which was very, very rare to come across, especially since I wasn't actively searching for why Dune is bad. But I find it a fascinating case study for this cult mentality that might be a little harsh to presume, but I feel that it kind of exists around Dune. Which is quite ironic actually, since according to these people, Dune is meant to be commentary on fanaticism. And they're actively engaging in this sort of fanatic behavior themselves, but anyway. The person who made the rant video is showing up on screen now. The YouTube channel is Miranda's Universe. They preface the video by saying that the video has no structure, it's just a rant, it's not a review, disclaimer, 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 this is all just personal opinion, disclaimer, disclaimer. Which is what makes what I'm about to say even more infuriating. The comments under this video were awful. I'm going to categorize them into two different types, excluding the genuinely nice comments because those were few and far between. Number 1, the blatantly patronizing and condescending. Number 2, the patronizing and condescending but dressed up as good, kindly advice. Spoiler, they weren't kindly, they were just patronizing. So I'm going to read a few of these out. The first type, the blatantly patronizing and condescending. Then she proceeds to give Twilight novel 10 out of 10. I can't imagine reading this and having it all go over your head. I weep for humanity. I've never seen someone make so many notes while reading but still not get the main gist or of it. I wasn't confused. Clearly you were. You know how that usually goes. Ha! You obviously don't. You have an amazingly surface level understanding of this book. Must be something about this book. It's only the best-selling sci-fi book of all time. Where do I even start? They're just so sarcastic and mean, and it's clear that all these commenters are just looking down on Miranda and thinking, oh, you're just a newbie to this fandom, you don't understand it. Let me posit this. Perhaps Miranda read the whole book, understood it. The parts they didn't understand were not because they're dumb and stupid and don't know how to read, but because the parts were just poorly written. And then decided that they didn't enjoy this book because it was boring and misogynistic and overhyped. Ever think about that? The second type of comments was the patronizing and condescending but dressed up as good kindly advice. Oh, don't feel too bad. Come back to it in a couple of decades. Great books often need years of life experience to unlock all their secrets. Respect for reading the whole book before giving an opinion. At least you gave it a try. I love Dune and the philosophical aspects, but it's not for everybody. I tried to read Dune when I was 20. Nope. Way too tedious and long. Read about half and then just gave up. Read it again at 31. Holy fucking shit, this is epic. It's my favourite book, and Dune is by far my favourite universe. That said, when it comes to Dune, there are only really two opinions. You either become utterly obsessed with it or you find it boring and tedious. So don't worry, there are plenty of people who agree with you, even if I don't. It should also be pointed out that Dune is very much a series of books, but if you didn't enjoy Dune, you almost certainly will not enjoy the rest of the books. So basically, what these comments are saying is that you're too young to understand. Come back to it decades later, and then maybe you'll understand. Or it's too philosophical for you to understand. It's not for everyone, certainly not dumb people. It's just unspoken there. Okay, so maybe it's good advice to come back to a book that you didn't enjoy the first time, and maybe you'll enjoy a second time after thinking about it for a bit or letting it sort of dwell in your mind. Could be good advice for some books, but dear Lord, definitely not this one. And there are so many good books in this world, why must you die on this hill? Just because it's been labelled canon and a classic? No, life's too short to reread a book you disliked the first time through. Just move on. And what really pains me is that this Miranda is just so nice to everyone, it breaks my heart. Notice how, after a lot of the comments, they've actually hearted them. And the fact that they feel the need to agree with the people looking down on them is just so heartbreaking. I do want to point out one commenter by the name of Scipio Americanos, who voices a lot of my exact thoughts very well. If you want to find those comments, they're replies to Guardian1032, who made a not a chosen one comment, because of course we needed plenty of those, and Scipio's replies are just very well articulated. I'll read out a few that calls back to some points that I've mentioned already. Who cares if Paul was a recontextualized hero, or chosen one, or whatever, if he was painfully boring to begin with? That only works with well-written characters that people actually have strong feelings towards. Or, a good protagonist is relatable, pretty much by definition, and the fact that Paul isn't shows the weakness of Herbert as a writer, not the strength of Paul as a character. That doesn't mean a good protagonist must be mundane or share a lot with their audience, but it does mean that a fantastical protagonist must be well written in order for people to still understand their motivations and empathize with them. Paul being unnaturally good at things at the age of 15, despite clearly being far from the most well-trained person in the book, just makes him even less interesting and more overpowered, and his destiny being known from day one only makes him boring. And I'll read out just one more that goes back to what I was talking about in part 2. Herbert's style of writing is not fill in the blanks. If anything, it's too detailed and holds your hand like you're an idiot, explaining almost everything multiple times. What he leaves out, things like character development and relatability, aren't things to be filled in, but more like half a book that he never bothered to write, and I have no interest in finishing it for him. I have a huge interest in history and philosophy, and knowing what I know of them made Dune worse, not better for me. The worst part was being able to see just how lazy Herbert's world building is when you realise that all his history is just a paper-thin retelling of the rise of Islam. I honestly have no interest in going beyond the first book, but what I saw upon finishing book 1 doesn't even come close to Tolkien or Martin in terms of the world building you get out of the Fellowship of the Ring or Game of Thrones, and on top of that, they both have interesting characters and an entertaining writing style. Hell, the world building in the first Star Wars film is more interesting, and that's only a couple hours long. So, back to me. Out of the ones name dropped just then, I've only read George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series, the first book being A Game of Thrones, so I can really call out my agreements to that one being a more interesting and better built world. The rest you'll have to judge for yourselves. But yeah, thank you, Scipio, out there, wherever you are. It's just a very nice and succinct way of voicing a lot of the opinions that I had and a lot of the hiccups I had while I was reading the book. So, alright, gone on this whole journey. What is my conclusion? Originally, the topic of debate I had for myself was a little different. It was just, is Dune considered sci-fi? Because I thought I had a lot to say about that, but since then I've realised that I had a lot more to say about not just whether or not it's typical sci-fi, but whether or not it's a good story at all. But this is originally what I wanted to say. So, what's the verdict? Is Dune sci-fi? According to many, it's the epitome of sci-fi, so short answer, yes it is. The masses have spoken. But personally, do I consider Dune to be sci-fi? This may ruffle some feathers, but going by the title of our video, no, I don't. And this isn't necessarily something unfortunate. In fact, a little tangent here, I think the sci-fi genre has a relatively bad reputation for being cheap, maybe less intelligent compared to many other genres. I definitely don't agree with that point of view, but it's undeniable that the sci-fi genre has somehow garnered that reputation for itself over the decades. So, booting Dune from the sci-fi genre is by no means my attempt to level it down or anything like that. I just think other genres might be more true to its content. So, that was a bit of past me speaking, and past me seemed a lot more reserved in their opinions. The longer I've spent on this, the more I think considering whether or not Dune is fitting for the sci-fi genre has become a moot point, because I've come to the conclusion that by wishing Dune to be booted from the sci-fi genre, I'm absolutely wishing to level it down. I wish this narrow-minded, regressive, misogynistic, backwards-thinking, culturally insensitive, ridiculously dreary story can be removed from its elitist pedestal as a must-read classic sci-fi book and be recognized for what it truly is, which is that it's a narrow-minded, regressive, misogynistic, backwards-thinking, culturally insensitive, ridiculously dreary story. Remove it from its pedestal as the crown jewel of the sci-fi genre and leave the sci-fi genre alone. Leave it less tainted, please. I was absolutely being too nice and reserved, and also kind of incorrect in what I originally wanted to say. Especially after reading all the condescending, elitist comments under Miranda's video, I no longer want to be half-hearted in presenting my thoughts just in order to appease the general consensus. Hence, since then, I've changed the title and the subject of the video from Is Dune even sci-fi to Dune is not good sci-fi, which I think is very indicative of how defensive I feel for Miranda, people like Miranda, and my own opinions. I did have a whole rant on what genres Dune could be considered under if it's not to be considered science fiction. But this is already turning out a lot longer than I anticipated, and I'm tired, and I can't be bothered, and who knew complaining would be so tiring? So instead I'll just throw out a few short points for consideration. Number 1. The spice powers are magic. They enhance the prophetic powers of the characters, and they have no sci-fi backing to them. It's true that science fiction is pretty much a magic system, and sci-fi can be considered an extension of the fantasy genre, but they're magic systems where the suspension of disbelief should work. Because of the nature of the world and the way the story has been established, the suspension of disbelief becomes broken the moment heavy reliance is attributed to the magical, all-enhancing powers of the spice. Number 2. It's a stereotypical hero's journey, where the hero is the chosen one. I've already made my case on why Paul is the chosen one, and any intentions on Frank Herbert's part to subvert or recontextualize the chosen one trope have been rendered ineffective by his poor execution. But Paul being the chosen one doesn't diminish its case as science fiction. Science fiction sports plenty of chosen ones. What does diminish its case as sci-fi is, as the chosen one, Paul predicts the future and makes his choices based on decidedly fantasy-based plot points. Number 3. One undeniable thing that seems to solidify the story as sci-fi in many people's minds is the interplanetary travel. My problem with that is, and I mentioned this briefly in part 2, If the planets are taken out and replaced by countries, and the story remains largely unchanged and still makes sense and is recognizable as its original story, then the fact that they're different planets and not different countries becomes a gimmick rather than anything cute and meaningful. Number 4. Clarke's third law, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, is often quoted to make the point that sci-fi is fantasy and that there is no clear distinction. True, there's often no clear distinction, but I believe plausibility is slightly more important in sci-fi than in fantasy, and the amount of plausibility I experienced reading this was next to none. Number 5, and also the last point for now, the themes Dune explores don't make it a sci-fi. Environmentalism, commentary on non-renewable resources, ecology, political intrigue, religion, cultural differences, language differences, speculations about the future, social commentary, none of those make the story sci-fi. None of those themes were even explored in enough detail for me to be convinced in their plausibility or the importance of them in the grand scheme of the story, other than the issues on environmentalism and political intrigue. But even then, the ideas on environmentalism are never properly resolved or explored to any depth other than in the appendices. They just exist for Frank Herbert to moralize every now and then throughout the story. And without the political intrigue, the story just wouldn't exist, so of course that had to be explored to some depth. At most, Dune is a fantasy political intrigue novel with a few sci-fi elements. Which sci-fi elements, you might ask? Well, the still suits and the chromoplastic Jew collectors are still pretty cute in my opinion, so there's that. In conclusion, Dune is not good sci-fi because of reasons twofold. First, because it's not good sci, and second, because it's not good fi. On the one hand, it doesn't make for a convincing sci-fi story, and it feels like a confused child trying to find its own identity. And on the other hand, nor does it make for an interesting story at all. It's just not a good piece of fiction, and in my humble opinion, it doesn't deserve to be heralded in its status as classic sci-fi. Yet I was determined to see it through because for the love of me, couldn't fathom why everyone was sucking Frank Herbert's Dune dick. Sealing him as the stereotypical one-dimensional Disney villain with the added bonus of reinforcing homophobic rhetoric, which we know that Disney hasn't exactly shied away from that either, so really the Baron is just straight out of Disney. Or more aptly, gay out of Disney. No, that's not... Cut that out, that's not making it in. The Mentats, on the other hand, are logical. They're driven by facts and logic and knowledge and wisdom and are basically the supercomputers who have replaced computers. Jesus. What I shan't let rest though is how this space... not space, spice. We get it, it's sci-fi. There's a fabric of legends for you. Think of all those experiences, the wisdom they bring, but wisdom tempers love, doesn't it? It puts a new shape on hate. How can you tell what's ruthless unless you've plumbed the depths of both cruelty and kindness? You should fear me, mother. I am the Kwisatz Haderach. Damn it, I can't pronounce that. Jessica tried to swallow in a dry throat. Presently she said, once you denied to me that you were the... God damn it. Kwisatz Haderach. I don't know. Paul shook his head. I can deny nothing anymore. You must understand that she does this out of kindness, he said. Isn't it odd? Cod. Fish. My friend Gurney Halleck wishes to kill a Harkonnen. If he... Canley. Fate Ratha. Can't pronounce any of these names. Screw it. I just won't read that part. The man stopped half across the dune crest, arms stretched down the